The silence at the dinner table began on a quiet evening when I first noticed that something was deeply wrong in my new home after marrying Syra, a woman whose gentle smile had convinced me that life was finally giving me a second chance. But her daughter Hania was different. She was only 7 years old, yet carried a silence heavier than anything I had ever seen in a child. She never greeted me, never spoke my name, never even looked at me directly, and at first I told myself she just needed time. Because children struggle to accept change, especially when a stranger suddenly becomes part of their world. But days turned into weeks and her silence did not soften. It grew colder, more distant, more unsettling. Every evening we sat together for dinner, and every evening the same painful scene repeated itself. Syra would place a plate in front of Hania, warm food carefully prepared with love, her voice trembling with hope as she gently urged her, "Hania, beta, please, just one bite, only one." But the child would sit still, her small hands resting beside the plate, her eyes fixed somewhere far away, as if the food did not exist, as if the entire room had faded into nothingness. I would watch from across the table, unsure of my place, unsure of how to step into a role that had never been offered to me. Yet every time I shifted in my seat or tried to speak, her body would stiffen, her shoulders would rise ever so slightly, and her eyes would drop, instantly avoiding mine as though my presence itself frightened her. And that thought haunted me because I had done nothing to deserve such fear. I had never raised my voice, never forced a conversation, never tried to replace anyone. I only wanted to create a safe space for both of them. Yet something invisible stood between me and that little girl, something broken and fragile that I could not see but could feel growing stronger with each passing day. Syra began to worry more openly as the pattern continued. She would try different dishes, sweet foods, her favorite meals, things that should have brought comfort, but nothing worked. Hania would not eat. Sometimes she would sit there for hours without touching a single bite, until Syra finally gave up, her face filled with quiet exhaustion and unspoken guilt. The doctors we visited offered simple explanations. They said it might be emotional stress adjustment issues or perhaps attention-seeking behavior, but deep inside I knew it was not that simple. There was something else, something hidden behind her silence. Something that made her withdraw not just from me but from the world itself. Late at night I would hear Syra crying softly in the other room, blaming herself, questioning her decisions, wondering if bringing me into their lives had somehow caused this. And each time I would reassure her, telling her it would take time, telling her we would figure it out together. But even as I spoke those words I felt a growing unease, because the truth was I did not understand what was happening, and that helplessness began to weigh on me heavily. I started observing Hania more carefully, not in a way that would make her uncomfortable, but quietly from a distance, trying to notice patterns, trying to understand what triggered her fear. And what did not I realize? That she was not always like this when I was not around. I once saw her through the half-open door of her room, sitting with her toys, whispering softly to herself, almost like a normal child lost in her own little world. But the moment she heard my footsteps approaching, everything changed. She froze instantly, her body going rigid, her voice disappearing into silence as though she had been caught doing something wrong. That reaction stayed with me because it was not shyness, it was fear, real, deep-rooted fear that no child should feel, especially not in their own home. One particular evening the tension reached a point I could no longer ignore. Syra had spent hours cooking, determined to get Hania to eat something, anything, but once again the little girl sat unmoving, her untouched plate growing cold in front of her. Syra's voice cracked as she begged again, her patience slipping into quiet desperation. And that was when I made a decision. I slowly stood up from my chair and walked toward them, keeping my movements gentle, careful not to startle her. I could feel my heart pounding as I lowered myself into the seat beside Hania, close enough to speak but not close enough to overwhelm her. For a moment I said nothing, allowing her to get used to my presence. Before I finally spoke, my voice soft, steady, trying to sound as safe as possible. "Hania, you can tell me anything." I did not expect an immediate response. I knew trust could not be forced, but I hoped at least for a glance, a small acknowledgement that she heard me. But she remained still, her eyes fixed on the plate as if my words had never reached her. Yet something subtle changed. Her fingers tightened slightly around the spoon, and that tiny movement caught my attention because it was the first reaction I had ever seen from her. When I spoke, I continued, gently choosing my words with care. "You do not have to be afraid here. No one will force you. Just tell me what is wrong." Again, silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, but this time it felt different, not empty, but filled with something unspoken, something waiting beneath the surface. I noticed the slight tremble in her hands, the way her breathing became uneven, and in that moment a realization struck me with quiet force. This was not stubbornness. This was not a child refusing to eat out of defiance. This was something far more serious, something that had taken root deep inside her and was controlling her every reaction. I felt a chill run through me as the thought settled in. My mind, because whatever she was carrying, it was bigger than fear of a new person. It was something that had taught her to stay silent, to stay still, to disappear within herself. And as I sat there beside her watching that small, fragile figure struggle with something she could not express, I knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning of a truth I was not prepared to face. But I could no longer ignore the whisper that changed everything. Began later that same night, when the house had fallen into a deep uneasy silence, and the weight of everything I had witnessed at dinner refused to let me rest. Syra had gone into the kitchen to clean up the untouched dishes, her movements slow and tired, as if she was carrying an invisible burden, while Hania remained seated at the table exactly where she had been left, her small figure almost frozen in place, as though time itself had stopped around her. I stood in the hallway for a moment, watching from a distance, my mind filled with questions that refused to settle, because something inside me kept insisting that tonight could not end like all the others. Something had shifted. I had seen it in the slight tremble of her hands and the way her fingers had tightened around the spoon, and I knew if I walked away now I might lose the only chance to reach her. So I took a slow breath and stepped forward, each movement careful and deliberate, so I would not startle her. When I reached the table, I pulled the chair quietly and sat beside her again, this time closer than before, but still leaving enough space for her to feel safe. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than anything else in that moment, but I forced my voice to remain calm as I spoke. Hania, please, you do not have to be scared. I am here to help you. Nothing will happen to you here. For a few seconds nothing changed. Her gaze remained fixed downward, her face expressionless, but then I noticed something different. Her breathing grew shallow, her shoulders tensed slightly, and her fingers began to tremble again. It was subtle, but it was there, and it told me that my words were reaching somewhere deep inside her. Even if she could not respond yet, I leaned forward just a little, lowering my voice even more, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile connection was forming. You can tell me anything, I will listen, I promise. Still silence, but it was no longer empty. It felt full of something struggling to come out, something trapped behind fear and hesitation. And then suddenly she moved. It was so slight I almost missed it. Her head tilted just a fraction toward me, and her lips parted as if she was about to speak, but stopped herself. I did not rush her, I did not push, I simply stayed there waiting, giving her the time she needed, because I understood now that whatever she was about to say had been buried inside her for a long time, and it would not come out easily. Seconds passed, it felt like hours, until finally she leaned just a little closer, her voice so faint it was almost lost in the silence. He said, you will hurt me too. For a moment I did not understand the words. They seemed to hang in the air without meaning, until they suddenly hit me all at once, and my chest tightened painfully. Who? I asked, my voice barely steady as I turned toward her fully, my heart racing with a fear I could not yet name. Her eyes filled with tears instantly, as if simply speaking those words had opened something inside her that she could no longer hold back. She hesitated again, her small hands gripping the edge of the table as if she needed something solid to keep her from falling apart. Before you came, Mama friend. Her voice broke as she struggled to form the words, each one heavy with pain that no child should ever carry. My mind went blank for a second as a cold realization began to form slowly and painfully. I felt my stomach twist as I tried to process what she was saying, but she continued, her words coming in broken pieces, as if she was reliving something she wanted to forget. He used to come when Mama was not home. He said, if I tell anyone, Mama will leave me. I felt something inside me shatter in that moment. The world around me seemed to fade, leaving only her words echoing in my head over and over again. Every strange behavior, every silent dinner, every fearful glance suddenly made sense in the worst possible way. She had not been rejecting me, she had been protecting herself from a danger she believed I might become, because someone had taught her that trust leads to pain and silence is the only way to stay safe. I wanted to say something, anything to comfort her, but the words would not come, because I was fighting a storm of emotions: anger, guilt, helplessness, and a deep, overwhelming sorrow for what this child had endured all alone. I clenched my hands tightly, trying to steady myself, because I knew I could not break down in front of her. Not now. She needed calm. She needed safety. She needed someone who would not react with fear or panic. So I forced my voice to soften again, even though it felt like my chest was collapsing from the weight of it. You did the right thing telling me nothing will happen to you. I am here now. You are safe. As I spoke those words, I realized how important they were, not just to her, but to me as well, because in that moment I made a silent promise to myself that I would not let her suffer in silence any longer, no matter how difficult the truth might be, no matter how painful it would be to uncover. I gently reached out, placing my hand near hers, but not touching, waiting to see if she would pull away, but she did not. Instead, her fingers slowly relaxed their grip on the table, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not look afraid of me. She looked afraid of something else, something in her past, something that had taken away her sense of safety and replaced it with fear and confusion. Tears rolled down her cheeks. silently, and I felt my own eyes burn, but I held them back because this moment was not about my pain, it was about hers, and as I sat there beside her listening to the quiet sound of her breathing slowly steadying, I understood that everything was about to change. The life I thought I had stepped into, the simple hope of building a family, the quiet belief that time would fix everything, it was all gone, replaced by a harsh reality that demanded action, because this was no longer about adjustment or misunderstanding. This was about protecting a child who had been hurt and making sure that the person responsible would never have the chance to hurt her again. And as that realization settled deep within me, I knew that whatever came next, whatever truth we would uncover, whatever battles we would have to face, I would not step back, I would not stay silent, and I would not fail her, because she had trusted me with her truth, and that trust would become the beginning of everything that followed. The truth, the betrayal, the plan began the very next morning, but it felt as if the night had never ended, because sleep had not touched my eyes, and Hania's fragile whisper echoed inside my mind again and again, reminding me that what I had learned could not be ignored even for a moment. When the first light entered the house, I found Syra in the living room, sitting quietly with a cup of tea in her hands, but she was not drinking it. Her eyes looked distant, as if she too had not slept, and I knew there was no easy way to say what needed to be said, so I walked toward her slowly, my chest heavy with the weight of truth, and when she looked up at me, I could see a flicker of concern in her expression, as if she already sensed that something was wrong. I did not sit down, I did not soften the moment. I spoke directly, because anything less would have been a betrayal to Hania. Syra, we need to talk about Hania. My voice was calm but firm, and she straightened slightly, placing the cup aside, her fingers trembling just enough to reveal her unease. What happened? She asked quickly, and for a brief second I hesitated, not because I doubted the truth, but because I knew the words I was about to speak would break something between us forever. But there was no turning back now. I told her everything, every word Hania had whispered, every piece of fear hidden behind her silence, and as I spoke I watched Syra's face change, the color draining slowly from her cheeks, her eyes widening in disbelief, then filling with tears that she could not hold back. Nash said quietly, shaking her head as if denying it could undo reality. That is not possible. There must be some misunderstanding. Her reaction did not surprise me. It was the kind of denial that comes when the truth is too painful to accept, but I could not let her stay in that place, not anymore. There is no misunderstanding, I said firmly. She told me herself, Syra. Her voice broke when she said it, and that means it is real. You cannot ignore this. The room fell into a heavy silence, and for a moment she said nothing. She simply stared at the floor, as if searching for a version of reality where this was not happening. But when she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I had doubts before the words hit me like a sudden shock, and I felt my breath catch in my chest. What do you mean you had doubts? I asked, my voice tightening despite my effort to remain calm. She covered her face with her hands, tears slipping through her fingers as she struggled to explain. He used to act strange, she said slowly, her words uneven and filled with regret. Hania would cry sometimes and refuse to be alone, but I thought maybe I was overthinking. Maybe she was just scared of being alone. I did not want to believe something was wrong. I felt anger rise inside me, sharp and uncontrollable, because what she was saying was not just fear, it was hesitation that had cost too much. You ignored it, I said, my voice shaking now, unable to hide the frustration. I was scared, she cried, lowering her hands and looking at me with eyes full of guilt. I did not want to destroy everything without proof. I did not want to believe someone I trusted could do something like that. Her words revealed the truth of the situation, not just the act itself, but the silence that allowed it to continue. And in that moment I realized that the betrayal was not only from the man who had hurt Hania, but also from the hesitation that had protected him. I turned away for a second, trying to steady myself, because anger alone would not fix what had already been done. We needed clarity, we needed action, and most importantly, we needed to protect Hania from any further harm. When I faced Syra again, my voice had changed. It was no longer filled with confrontation, but with resolve. We cannot undo the past, but we can decide what happens next. She nodded, slowly wiping her tears, as if gathering the strength to face what was coming. What do we do? She asked, and that was the moment when a plan began to form in my mind, not driven by revenge alone, but by the need for justice and safety. We do this carefully, I said. We do not confront him directly, not yet. We gather proof, we make sure there is no way he can deny what he has done. She listened closely, her expression shifting from despair to determination as I explained everything step by step. We would document Hania's statement in a way that could be used. We would pay attention to any messages or calls that could connect him to the situation. We would speak to people who might have noticed his behavior without raising suspicion. It would not be quick and it would not be easy, but it had to be done right, because one mistake could give him the chance to escape. Accountability. Days passed as we followed through with the plan, each moment filled with tension, because we were living in the same world where he existed, pretending nothing had changed while quietly building a case against him. I Remained careful around Hania, never pushing her to speak more than she was ready for, but reassuring her in small ways that she was safe, that she was not alone, and slowly I began to see a shift in her, not complete healing, but a slight release of the fear that had controlled her for so long. Syra also changed. The guilt that once held her back turned into a quiet strength. She stayed closer to Hania, more attentive, more present, as if trying to make up for every moment she had doubted her own instincts. Finally, the day came when we had enough evidence, enough truth to take the next step. We went to the authorities together, the weight of everything we had carried now placed into the hands of those who could act on it. And as I stood there recounting the story, once more I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger at what had been done, relief that we were finally doing something about it, and a deep sense of responsibility, because this was no longer just about exposing a crime. It was about restoring a sense of safety to a child who had lost it when we left the building that day. Syra looked at me, her eyes still carrying pain, but also gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, and I shook my head, because this was not something that required thanks. It was something that should have been done from the beginning. "This is not over," I replied quietly, "but it has begun." And as we walked back home together, I knew that the path ahead would not be easy. There would be consequences, there would be moments of doubt and fear, but there would also be justice, and most importantly, there would be a chance for Hania to reclaim the childhood that had been taken from her, and that was something worth every effort, every sleepless night, every difficult step, because this was no longer just a plan. It was a promise that I intended to keep, no matter what it took. Sweet revenge, and a new beginning began in the quiet aftermath of everything we had endured. When the storm had finally passed, but its echoes still lingered in the corners of our home, the man who had brought fear into Hania's life was gone, taken away by the authorities after the truth had been revealed, and for the first time since I had entered that house there was no shadow of his presence hanging over us yet. Peace did not return all at once, because healing does not come as quickly as justice. Even though he was no longer there, the fear he had planted inside Hania did not disappear overnight. It remained hidden in her silence, in the way she avoided sudden movements, in the way her eyes still searched for danger even in safe moments. And I understood that what she needed now was not just protection, but patience, not just safety, but reassurance that would slowly rebuild the trust she had lost. Days turned into weeks, and I stayed consistent in the smallest ways possible. I did not force conversations. I did not ask her to explain anything again. I simply existed beside her, calmly and gently, creating an environment where she could feel secure without pressure. Every evening I sat at the dinner table, at the same time placing food on my plate and eating quietly without looking at her, waiting without expectation as Syra continued to sit close to her, offering gentle encouragement but no longer pleading, because we both understood that forcing her would only push her further into herself. There were moments when nothing changed, when she still sat still, her plate untouched, her gaze distant, and those moments tested my patience. But I reminded myself that healing is not a straight path. It moves slowly, sometimes so slowly that it feels like nothing is happening at all, until one day something shifts in a way that cannot be ignored. That moment came on a calm evening when the air felt lighter than usual and the house seemed to breathe differently. I sat down, as always, picking up my spoon and beginning to eat quietly, aware of her presence beside me, but not focusing on it. Minutes passed in silence, and then I heard the faintest sound, the soft scrape of a spoon against a plate. I froze for a second, unsure if I had imagined it, but when I looked up carefully, I saw her hand moving slowly, her fingers wrapped around the spoon as she lifted it with hesitation and brought it toward her mouth. It was a small movement, almost fragile, as if even that simple act required courage. She took a tiny bite, and for a moment everything felt still, as though the world itself had paused to witness it. I forced myself not to react, not to speak, not to let my emotions interrupt what was happening, because I knew that even a single word could break the delicate balance of that moment. So I continued eating, pretending nothing had changed, even though inside me something had begun to heal alongside her. She took another bite, and then another, each one slightly more certain than the last, and I could feel a quiet warmth spreading through my chest. Not relief, not victory, but something deeper, something that felt like hope, slowly returning to a place where it had once been lost. When she finally lowered her spoon, she did something she had never done before. She looked at me, not briefly, not by accident, but directly, her eyes meeting mine with a softness that had not been there before, and in that gaze I saw something new, something that had replaced the fear that once lived there. It was not complete trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of it, and that was enough. Then, in a voice so gentle it almost blended into the silence, she spoke. "You did not hurt me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had been through, everything she had feared, everything she had believed might happen, and in that moment I understood that this was not just a statement, it was a realization, a quiet acknowledgement that the world was not entirely dangerous, that not everyone would bring pain. I felt my throat tighten as I struggled to respond because no words felt big enough to hold the meaning of what she had just said, but I kept my voice steady and calm. I never will. The promise came naturally, not forced, not dramatic, just honest and certain, because I knew it was something I would spend the rest of my life proving to her. She hesitated for a second, as if deciding something within herself, and then slowly she shifted closer to me, her movement careful, almost unsure but deliberate, and when she finally rested her head gently against my arm, time seemed to stop once again. I did not move, I did not react, I simply stayed still, allowing her to remain there as long as she needed, because that small gesture was more powerful than anything else. It was trust, it was acceptance, it was the breaking of a wall that had kept her isolated in fear for so long. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, but I did not wipe it away, because it was not a tear of sadness, it was something else, something that came from witnessing a moment of healing so pure that it could not be described in words. In that quiet space I realized something important. Revenge does not always come in the form of destruction or punishment. It does not always mean making someone suffer the way they made others suffer. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is rebuilding what was broken, restoring what was taken, proving that pain does not have the final say. The man who had tried to control her through fear had lost in the deepest way possible, not just because he was gone, but because his actions had failed to define her future. She was still here, still capable of trusting, still capable of healing, and that was something he could never take away from her. As the days continued, the changes became more visible. She began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small words, small responses that slowly grew into something more natural. She started to smile, occasionally shy and brief, but real, and each time it happened it felt like a victory, not for me, not for Syra, but for her, because every step forward was something she had earned through her own strength. Syra watched these moments with quiet gratitude, her eyes often filled with tears, but also with relief, as she too began to forgive herself, slowly understanding that while she could not change the past, she could be present now in the way that truly mattered. Our home changed as well. The heavy silence that once filled it was replaced with a softer, calmer atmosphere, one that no longer felt suffocating but safe, and in that safety we began to build something new, something that was not perfect but real, a family not defined by what had happened to us, but by how we chose to move forward together. And as I sat there one evening watching Hania eat without fear, speaking softly with her mother, occasionally glancing at me with a quiet sense of comfort, I knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her, but for all of us, a chapter where fear no longer controlled the narrative, where silence was no longer a shield, and where trust could grow again, slowly, steadily, and truthfully. And in that realization I found a sense of peace that I had not expected, because the journey had been painful, the truth had been heavy, and the road ahead would still require patience and care, but we had taken the first and most important step. We had faced the darkness and chosen not to let it define us, and that choice, that quiet, powerful decision, was what made everything else possible. It was what turned pain into strength, it was what transformed fear into trust, and it was what gave us a future that was no longer shaped by what we had lost, but by what we had found together, a sense of safety, a sense of belonging, and most importantly, a sense of hope that would continue to grow with each passing day.